Hello and welcome back. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to go over the difference between raster and vector files. Understanding whether Photoshop is a raster or vector-based software will help you better understand how the software works and its limitations. So let's go over the differences between raster and vector files and which one Photoshop uses. So what exactly is a raster file? Well, a raster file is an image made up of thousands and thousands of pixels or dots. The most common type of raster file are photographs. Now, if we zoom into this photo, you can see that it's made up of little dots or pixels. The advantages to a raster image is the vast amount of detail. If you're familiar with the term DPI, then you know that means dots per inch. DPI is a measurement of how much detailed color information the raster image contains. All right, I'm going to go ahead and crop this image to 1 inch by 1 inch. All right, so originally this image was captured at 300 DPI. Now that the image has been resized to a 1 inch by 1 inch image, it now has 300 rows of pixels and 300 columns of pixels, and these pixels provide the precise shading details of the photograph. Now, if your photo has more than 300 DPI, then that means the subtle details will more likely be visible versus a lower DPI photo file. In this case, if we shot this image at 600 DPI, then the number of pixels per column and row would double. Now, there is another advantage to rasterized images, and that's on the individual pixels, and that basically means we can modify each one of these individual pixels one by one. However, one of the main disadvantages of raster images is they become blurry when enlarged, and the more you enlarge a photo, the more pixelated it becomes. And another disadvantage to raster images are the file sizes. For example, let's take a look at this image here, and if we crop this to 4 inches by 6 inches with a 300 DPI, it has over 2 million individual pixels of color information, and the file size is 823 kilobytes. Now, if you take this same photo and resize it to 16 inches by 24 inches, then it's going to have over 34 million individual pixels of color information to remember, and then when you save it, the file size is going to be over 5 megabytes. So think about it. There are millions of more pixels in the larger photo size, and then what happens is when you increase the size of the smaller image, which is 4 by 6, and convert it to 16 by 24, what happens is Photoshop will have to add additional pixels that are not there. And that's why your photo becomes blurry or pixelated as you increase it from a smaller sized file. So it's always best to shoot at the highest resolution possible so you don't have this effect of pixelization or a blurry image the larger you go in print size. Okay, now that you know what a raster file is, let's take a look at vector files. Now, a vector file, unlike a raster file, uses math to draw shapes using points, lines, and curves. Now, as I mentioned, in a raster file that is made up of individual pixels, you could have 90,000 individual pixels in a 1 inch by 1 inch square at 300 DPI. However, a vector image will only have 4 points, one for each corner. Your software will then use math to connect the dots and fill in all the missing information. Now, the most common types of graphic files are fonts or logos, and graphic designers prefer to use a vector-based program for creating these types of files, and the most popular is Adobe Illustrator. So the biggest advantage of vector files is the ability to scale the file infinitely. Unlike raster files, you can scale your vector file up or down as much as you want without losing any quality. And that's because your vector files will simply use mathematics to create a consistent shape every time you resize. And then if you compare that to a raster file, which your software has to guess at, and add those extra pixels that are missing when resizing. Then another advantage to vector files are the size of the files. And this is because vector files, in a simple example, only use 4 corners versus 300 rows and 300 columns of individual pixels for the raster file. Now, the disadvantages or the limitations to a vector file is actually due to the mathematics used to create a vector file, and that is the amount of detail in a vector file is limited versus a raster file. So a vector file is not ideal for complex images that require specific coloring. Although Photoshop is primarily a raster image-based software, you can also create vector objects as well, like font-based projects or maybe some type of logos or other types of vector files that you may want to create. Although you can do in Photoshop, as a graphic designer myself, I prefer Adobe Illustrator for those types of projects, but occasionally I will do font-based projects in Photoshop versus Illustrator, and that's because I use a lot of photography in my advertising as well, and will use the font tools in Photoshop to make flyers or brochures or other types of advertising material that I may need. So depending on the type of work you do, if you're primarily a photographer, then Photoshop is really all you need. If you need to do a little bit of advertising or marketing type material, even if you're just a photographer, you can still use Photoshop for that type of stuff. But if you're a graphic designer creating logos and branding and other types of specialized graphics, then you're probably better off using both Photoshop and Illustrator depending on the project. And there you have it, raster versus vector files. Raster files have great color detail, but can't be enlarged without becoming blurry, while vector files you can enlarge without losing quality, are limited on the detail and the shading of that file. All right, so that concludes our first section on Photoshop. In the next section, we're going to look into how to be more productive in Photoshop, and that's going to include setting up your Photoshop preferences, color preferences, customizing your menus, and much, much more. So you're not going to want to skip that part, because not only are we going to set up Photoshop to work for you instead of you working Photoshop, but you're going to learn other time-saving techniques as well. So if you're ready to get started on that, let's do it.